Namaskar. Welcome to this edition of the India Foundation podcast. This edition of the India Foundation podcast features the conversation between Mr. Jonathan McClory, author and creator Soft Power 30 Index, and Mr. Sudarshan Ramabadran, Administrative Head, Center for Public Diplomacy and Soft Power, and Senior Research Fellow at the India Foundation. Let's hear this conversation.
We are going to be discussing a interesting topic, which is digital diplomacy in the global information age, opportunities and challenges. And we have with us a special guest to discuss the same. I'll first introduce him, Jonathan McClory. Jonathan is the creator and author of the Soft Power 30 Index and a specialist in soft power, digital diplomacy, public diplomacy, cultural relations, and place branding. Based in Singapore, he is Portland's General Manager for Asia. Though Jonathan will soon be relocating to London as a partner at the advisory firm Sanctuary Council, he has advised senior government clients in the UK, Europe, Middle East, and Asia on reputations, policy, and effective global engagement. Before working in the private sector, Jonathan was a senior researcher at the Institute for Government, short form IFG. While at the IFG, Jonathan created the world's first composite index for measuring the soft power of countries. This prior research helped inform the development of the Soft Power 30 Index, which is now used as a benchmark by governments across the world. So in this podcast, we're going to be discussing with Jonathan digital diplomacy in the global information age, opportunities and challenges. Warm welcome to you, Jonathan. Hope you're keeping well.
Thank you, Sudarshan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I'll begin by asking you this. Cyber diplomacy, e-diplomacy, and now popularly digital diplomacy are best used to describe the modes of effectively combining technology and diplomacy. Could you help, for the benefit of our viewers, define digital diplomacy in the global information age?
Sure, that's a great starting question. I think the best definition for digital diplomacy is the simplest definition, which is basically it's the conduct of diplomacy, which is the conduct of relations between states, just using digital tools. And digital diplomacy, if that's the case, if it's just diplomacy by digital means, it's actually been around for a while now. It's seen as a very new thing, and in many ways, tools of it are certainly new. But you could say the first act of digital diplomacy took place in 1994 when then President Bill Clinton exchanged emails with the then Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt. So that was sort of the first practice of digital diplomacy, if you like. Now, the way that we think about digital diplomacy, that people like you and I, Sudarshan, would think about it, or the way that practitioners think about it, or academics think about it, is really the practice of public diplomacy through digital means. And so public diplomacy is not government to government. It's not G to G. It's government to the public, right? So it's one government A, talking to people in country B, and trying to listen to what those people think, trying to inform the policies of their country, and then also trying to persuade as well the people in that country why the country A's path is the right path, and why they should be partners. And so a lot of public diplomacy in terms of digital diplomacy is practiced through social media, right? That's a lot of what digital diplomacy is, how it operates, and what people are looking at when they research it. So I think I've gone on a lot and made that more complex than it needs to be. But to boil it down, it's the conduct of diplomacy as we would understand it, simply using digital tools.
Thank you for giving me a cue to my next question. Today, like you said, digital diplomacy has become an indispensable part of global affairs. How do you think public diplomacy, that is government to public, has adapted to the opportunities of digital technologies and social media to become more effective in not just communicating with foreign but domestic audiences as well?
So I think it's taken a while for governments to grasp this and get on board with it. And it was really, the first two movers on it were the US State Department, followed by then the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office. But it was really the State Department was out front. And the reason that they were out front was, as you've just said, the domestic aspect of this, right? So you had President Barack Obama ran the first truly digital campaign, and that commitment to and the insight into the potential of digital communications then carried on through the administration. And there were two big figures within the State Department, Jared Cohen and Alec Ross, who had worked, I believe they had both worked, or certainly Alec had worked on the Obama campaign on digital communications. They went into the State Department and tried to transform the public diplomacy elements of the State Department and bring them up to speed with all the tools of digital communications and engagement. So it started, with domestic politics and seeing how powerful it was to reach out to voter bases and constituencies and new voter bases, constituencies that wouldn't have been there or might not have voted, might not have donated campaign money for ever before. The number of first-time donors of the Obama campaign was incredible. So the U.S. State Department really got things moving. The FCO soon followed suit, but I think for a lot of governments, it's been a kind of start-stop and at times less than smooth journey. So when it was William Hague was the Foreign Secretary in 2010, stories that I've heard basically said he came in and he said, I don't want anything to do with this social media stuff. It's not for me. But eventually he had some good advisors in there. And in fact, there was one FCO staff member called Jimmy Leach, who was really critical in sort of cajoling the foreign secretary into doing this. And when he saw the potential and the power of it, he finally bought into it and finally took to it. And then it was, I suppose, for the UK's FCO, it was a bit more grassroots, and you had some ambassadors really take to it. And I think this is true across foreign ministries, around the world. Some ambassadors really take to it. So in the UK, you had Tom Fletcher, who is the former ambassador, UK's ambassador to Lebanon, was one of the front runners and trailblazers for digital diplomacy for the UK. And still has a really big following on social media. But then you had other ambassadors who just, wanted nothing to do with it. And it's understandable because diplomats and foreign ministries are historically, small c conservative. They're risk averse, and it's understandable why they are. But some have really gone for it, and others have been a bit slow. But it has been interesting to watch the impact that domestic politics has had in cajoling and bringing along diplomats and foreign ministries. And then I'd say from 2016 onwards, digital diplomacy became the norm, right? It's not really a new thing. It is now expected. And once the US and UK got going, you had countries like Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade started to get on board with this. And then you started to see foreign ministries build up their central capability and capacity in digital diplomacy, which is good because they needed the center, back in the capital to create digital content and write the rules of engagement, things like that, and then push it out to missions. But I think now, it is expected of diplomatic missions for the top tier of foreign ministries around the world that those missions can handle it on their own, that they have in-house capability and capacity to create engaging digital content, and they've got confident diplomats and chiefs of mission who can engage digitally. And I think the other countries that have taken to this pretty well. France, off the back of Emmanuel Macron's election victory in 2017. really, I mean, I think he's done an excellent job. Your own Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has been, I mean, he's a digital diplomacy rock star. And I remember we covered in the Soft Power 30 report, I think it was 2017, we looked at this phenomenon called the Modi effect, where whenever Prime Minister Modi went to visit another leader in their country, that leader would then see a bump up in their social media following. So he would, he was the rising tide that lifted all boats when it came to digital diplomacy.
You are a practitioner. I want to ask you, in your view, how can digital technology, information and communication technology be actually used to advance diplomacy?
Yeah. So this is where I think it's really important to say that digital diplomacy and the way that it's used, it's a tool, or is it a set of tools in a toolbox? And no amount of bad diplomacy or bad policy or bad messaging can be saved by digital diplomacy, right? So you have to have all the fundamentals right anyway. It helps to have an engaging leader, it helps to have good policy, and it helps to have good messaging. So the biggest thing that it can do is it helps you reach more people. This is what makes it so powerful, is the ability to reach more people, new audiences with new content. It also means that diplomats and leaders, politicians, if we're thinking about it's a blurred boundary between domestic and international. They all have to be available, not necessarily 24/7, but certainly regularly. They have to be willing to engage and respond. And those that are, and I go back to the example of Tom Fletcher. I think what made him such a good, well, not just digital diplomat, but diplomat full stop, was that he genuinely made himself available to the Lebanese public, and he would get involved in debates. And he didn't see it as a tool for broadcast, right? I mean, this is another important point. It's not just about the broadcasting or persuading, informing publics, but it's about listening as well. And I think too often that gets overlooked. The power of these digital tools to help diplomats and governments listen to the people that they're trying to engage with, to know not just what it is that they want, but what do they think right now, and how do you find the common ground and go forward.
I was reading a very interesting report where experts in the field were foreseeing how the internet and technology would be in 2050. Huh. So one of the assessments or inferences there was the age of unregulated internet will come to an end. Elected officials or heads of states will regulate internet with laws. Your views?
Yeah, it will have to. I mean, it feels like we are still in the Wild West phase of the internet, but it's hard to know exactly where that regulation will come from. The internet is borderless, so a single nation state trying to impose its will on the whole of the internet is virtually impossible. I think there are maybe 3 nation states that can try to nudge things, and that's probably the U.S., India, and China. I mean, we saw what big deal it was when India banned apps and websites like TikTok and others from China, and that was a big that was a big splash. So countries of that size can maybe try and nudge it, but not entirely. And I think the EU's GDPR regulation that came into effect is probably the best example of not a nation state, but a supranational structure that can impose its will and regulations fairly effectively. I mean, there were a countless number of websites that don't operate in Europe, but they complied with GDPR regulation because they wanted to continue to be accessed in Europe. So I think it will have to be multilateral efforts that drive internet governance forward. But we're in this period of time right now where we're not very multilateral friendly at all. I think we'll bounce back from it eventually, but I think it can only be done in that way. Because as I say, there's no way a single nation state can do this on their own. And it shouldn't be up to the European Union alone to set the rules for everybody. But if we don't work out the multilateral structures and the right forum in which to hash this all out, then we're kind of at risk of that happening, or a worst case scenario, a kind of bifurcation of the internet, where you sort of have the US driven Western internet and then a Chinese driven one going one way, and then people kind of pick and choose which way are they going to go. The other source of potential regulation could be from companies themselves, from the different platforms. So, we've seen what Facebook and Twitter have both done in terms of removing some content that they found, whether it's glorifying violence or whatever it might be, or it's promoting misinformation, or particularly around COVID-19. I mean, that has life or death consequences, and so I think they should be applauded for doing what they've done to pull things down. I also think Twitter's step of identifying and flagging certain accounts that are either government or politician accounts, or associated with the state in some way, like state-backed media, I think that's a step in the right direction. So as I say, until we get back to a space where multilateralism is the norm, we're going to have this weird kind of mix of companies doing it themselves, the European Union driving regulation that suits them and their citizens, constituents, and then maybe US, China, or India kind of trying to throw their weight around and having regional impacts, but not being able to impose their will on everybody.
I think one larger moot point question could be this: according to you, is digital diplomacy helping solve foreign policy problems today?
It has, I think, and it can. But I go back to what I said just a minute ago, that ultimately digital diplomacy is a toolbox and a set of tools. And those tools can be used for good, and they can be used for ill, like any tool. Or they can be used effectively, they can be used badly. I think there are examples, though, where it has been a good thing, which maybe, depending on your own kind of beliefs or policy biases. But let me give an example of the Iran nuclear deal, right, going back to 2015, 2016. I think the digital diplomacy push around that, which you could argue is spearheaded by the US, but involved a number of other countries and government officials. And that was I think a really effective, joined up, cooperative effort using digital diplomacy to not just convince other kinds of heads of state, but convince a global public and different constituencies. Also, I would say an American constituency as well, which was sort of, kind of split down the middle in a way, that this is the right thing to do and this is going to lead us to a safer world. So that was quite good. But I don't think simply by default digital diplomacy is, or advancements in digital diplomacy will ultimately bring us to a world of more effective conduct of foreign policy and diplomacy. That's just not the case, because, as I say, it's a set of tools.
Many countries like India, Sweden, France, Germany are active in enabling their soft power prowess through digital diplomacy. How do you exactly think digital diplomacy aids in this?
Yeah, well, we can kind of break that down into two parts. The first one being just having a good digital ecosystem, being seen as a country that drives technological progress, which is often wrapped up in digital progress. That's a good thing. If that's seen as something that benefits global society, then that's great. That's naturally good for a country's soft power. So you think of, for the US, the soft power of Silicon Valley, hugely important. And likewise in India, the ecosystem, the digital ecosystem of Bangalore, for example, is a big deal, and digital is a big part of India's soft power. So that is important. The other part, the use of digital diplomacy, I think, again, I go back to it's an opportunity to reach more people. So it scales up these countries' ability to just share information, to listen to people, and to engage with them, and also to engage with different types of content that would have been impossible 10 years ago. And I quite like this. This example is a couple of years old now, But the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs had this great campaign called the Swiss Touch, and it was the campaign brought together actual physical face-to-face events with a great digital campaign. So they built this beautiful table that was crafted in Switzerland. And then they took that table around. It started off different parts in the US, but then I think in the end they took it around the world. And they hosted a series of dialogues, discussions about issues that were important to the rest of the world, like sustainability and climate change and things like that. And it was a nice mix of doing these live, in-person events and discussions, but then they had all kinds of digital content, videos, interviews that then they pushed out on their channels. And it was a really nice mix of those things. And the ability to do that and produce that kind of content out of a handful of what were ultimately roundtables, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was impossible. You'd never happen. So the ability to reach more people, I think, is what makes it so helpful.
I'm going to come to some risks. What do you foresee as remedies to address risks of digital diplomacy, like hacking? There's culture of anonymity. There's propaganda by non-state actors.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the $1 million question. And I don't think anybody has a really good answer to it just yet. I think it's going to take something very big and very significant. So in a way, I think the world needs a new Geneva Convention, or a Vienna Convention on diplomacy, that sort of thing. Something that can set the ground rules. That are both in terms of digital diplomacy, but also, I mean, what you're talking about is, malicious influence campaigns, information warfare, hybrid warfare. We don't have rules on this, and I think we're going to need a convention where at least the vast majority of the world's governments can come together and say, these are the rules, and you have to abide by them, or there will be some form of collective punishment. Until we have something like that, in the absence of a new convention, which I think would be tied up in wider global governance of the internet, until we have a collection of countries make a real world physical response to some of this nasty stuff, it will keep happening. So if you think about the expulsion of 153 Russian diplomats, for Russia, for the Russian government's alleged involvement in the poisoning of Sergei Skripal in the UK. That was a huge deal. Until we have that kind of a response to what looks like a pretty cut and dry disinformation campaign that sends a signal to the rest of the world, this isn't going to be tolerated. And even if you try and hide behind, non-state actors, if we can pinpoint these actions coming from a given country, we will respond. Until that happens, it's hard to see this being resolved in a comprehensive way. Short of that, I think there are a handful of governments that are doing a good job in thinking about how governments can help people combat disinformation. Because ultimately, I think it has to be an exercise in capacity and capability building for citizens. Governments can't do all of this, but what they can do is help inoculate people against disinformation. And this is by teaching people how to spot and identify disinformation. I think government has a role in flagging it. But anyway, so there's a couple of good toolkits out there. One that was developed by the British government called Resist. But that work was actually led by kind of a international team out with some researchers based out of Sweden. I think it was Lund University, and one of the key people behind that is a guy called James Pament, who now I believe is with the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. So I think that should be the real objective needs to be some kind of a global convention that sets the rules on this. But until we get that, I think it's about smart governments trying to make their own people smarter in spotting and rejecting disinformation.
I'm going to speak about a rather ask you about big data now. In the year, I was reading a report, in the year 2000, only 25% of the world's stored information was in digital form. But this rose to almost 98% by 2014. I'm sure you must have updated data too. Do you see digital diplomacy using big data as a catalyst, and are countries assessing big data to see where their image or message is resonating?
Yeah. So they should be doing more, basically. And I've not, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but I haven't come across kind of the gold standard of this from any Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In fact, I think most big data work, when we're talking about government or political communications, is happening around election campaigns. And it's domestically focused. I do know that there are certain almost bureaucratic challenges. So, for example, the State Department has is bound by, I think, some regulations and legislation around even keeping lists on people. So that there are regulations around what kind of data they're allowed to hold and use, which can limit the use of big data. I think foreign ministries would need to be really careful about this, right? Because when we think of big data and political messaging or campaigns, it makes us think of things like Cambridge Analytica, or kind of misuse of people's data privacy. And so you could almost imagine a situation where even if a well-meaning foreign ministry built up a big data program and it leaks and it's spun in the wrong way, it's going to do much more harm than good. So I think there are possibilities certainly to explore there, but I haven't seen any kind of gold standard program yet, and I think foreign ministries would need to be careful about how they're using it, why they're using it, and how that might be received and presented to the outside world.
Another futuristic question. Virtual reality and hollow imaging are trends in the Gen Next and Gen Y tools of digital diplomacy. These are emerging. Could you throw some light on these emerging trends? Which are some of the countries investing in these to tap into their potential?
Yeah. So now, again, there could be programs that I'm not aware of, but I haven't seen anything from the sort of the mainstays that have traditionally driven digital diplomacy that are doing anything worth mentioning on virtual reality or hollow imaging or things like that. I think where the really cutting edge stuff is going to come from will be the NGO space. So non-government entities that are either, whether they're aid bodies or pressure groups or things like that. So, your Amnesty International's Committee for the Protection of Journalists. I think those types of organizations will probably be the ones that will push the boundaries. I know one example to mention, the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, which operates out of the West Bank. And they have done this really interesting VR program, and it's even an exhibition where they're trying to show the outside world what is it like living in the West Bank, and all the challenges that come with that, and it's remaining totally neutral on the situation. I think it's a really powerful way to show people who would never travel to Palestine, would never travel to the West Bank, probably wouldn't be able to, kind of thing, to actually show them what life is like there. And that to me gets to the essence of what digital diplomacy is all about: reaching larger, wider audiences with content that would have been impossible for them to access or consume 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I think that's an interesting one in terms of use of virtual reality. But I do think it will be those types of pressure groups or maybe people that are more underrepresented, or people struggling for sovereignty of their own that will use more cutting edge stuff to try and get more attention. Whereas traditional ministries of foreign affairs, it takes them a while to get up to speed with this stuff, and I wouldn't look to them for the cutting edge stuff. They'll probably be later adapters to having seen others do it do it well and do it in an effective way.
I want to ask you, what is the impact that you notice of digital diplomacy in traditional diplomatic practices? We do have some traditional diplomatic practices, right? Like negotiation, for instance, or persuasion, or you may know many more. So, what is the impact digital diplomacy is having in these traditional diplomatic practices?
It's an added element to all of them. So going back to the Iran deal, I think we wouldn't have seen, they wouldn't have had those tools to do that, to try and bring international publics along with them, arguing that this is the right thing to do, or even what was it, a couple of months ago, was it last month, when the election of the next members of the UN Security Council was announced, and Ireland and Canada were fighting a very, or not fighting, it's probably the wrong word, but it was a very close contest. They were competing for a single slot on the UN Security Council, and there were digital components to those campaigns. And trying to engage with the public on an issue that is otherwise seen as a real kind of backroom, horse trading, corridors of power kind of thing. So it brings people into the whole process, and I think it also means there is no excuse anymore for ignoring the court of global public opinion. You have to, you need to get your message out there. You need to be available. So it just means that it's one more element that diplomats have to be aware of, that even that G2G stuff is kind of opened up and seen in a slightly more transparent way.
I want to come to the SOFPA 30 report now. The digital subindex, as part of the annual SOFPA 30 index and report, comprises a combination of metrics that capture a country's digital connectivity, the effectiveness of government online services, and the use of digital diplomacy as such. Could you explain to our viewers and listeners briefly how countries are faring as per this subindex?
Yeah. One of the things that's interesting about the digital subindex is that the top 10, at least the top 5 of the digital subindex looks a lot like the top 5 of the overall subindex. So I think it tells you that those countries that are up to speed on driving digital innovation, that already have a lot of soft power resources to work with, they're the ones who tend to find it really easy, and I suppose they have the resources as well to put into digital diplomacy. I think there are a few other countries where they might not be as strong on specifically the digital diplomacy side. They're really good on the digital infrastructure side or government e-services. So if you look at the countries that are in that top 10 that are particularly really good on the government e-services, countries like Denmark, Singapore, Japan, Norway, South Korea, India as well. As I was saying, the digital component is a real strength. If you, including India in total, India's 25th on the digital subindex, and I think not just helped by its own digital infrastructure, but helped a great deal by the Prime Minister's significant international social media following and how well he uses that. So yeah, there's a strong overlap, though, like I said, at the very top end of the table between the digital subindex and overall soft power.
My final question to you is this, before I let you go. Some analysts and authors have said that technology would divide the society in the future. What are your thoughts on this, looking into the future?
Oh man, that's a big question, Sudarshan.
We should have a separate discussion on that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would claim no expertise, but as an observer, so there's an economist based in Geneva called Richard Baldwin. He was a pupil of Paul Krugman's, right, the Nobel Prize winning economist. Richard published a book last year. It came out beginning of last year, called The Globotics Upheaval. And the book is about all the challenges associated with both globalization and automation and things like AI and just technological advancements. And he does some future gazing, what can we expect from this? And he comes down, challenges notwithstanding, he comes down to a more optimistic take, and I tend to agree with him that it will probably be bumpy, but technological disruption and things like AI and automation will eventually lead us to a better place if all of those challenges are managed well. But I think it will. Managing that will require some innovative and different political solutions that I don't know if people are particularly ready for. So like the debate on universal income kind of thing. Do we eventually get to a place like that? I think that kind of thinking probably needs to happen hand in hand with, the big displacement that will happen as a result of automation and AI and technological disruption. But I think overall it should get us to a better place, hopefully.
On that note, thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining me. And as always, I'm sure our viewers and listeners would take back a lot from your rich insights. We look forward to hosting you in India soon. And as always, let's stay connected. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the India Foundation podcast. Do like, share, and subscribe the India Foundation channel.